Welcome back to the studio, to Red's Tech Studio. This time, I'm joined by engineer Stefano Cordara, director of Red. Once again, we're tackling a topic that's very close to your hearts. The head-to-head comparison within the sport touring world. A broad category that includes a sporty model like the Ninja 1100 SX SE, which is going up against its own sibling, the Kawasaki Versys 1100 SE. Because this isn't the first time we've compared these two worlds, crossover versus sport touring. Who comes out on top? Stefano, thank you for being here.
First of all, as I mentioned in the S1000 XR and R1250 RS video, these videos are also your fault because the topic of sport touring versus crossover is of great interest. And after that video, we received 1,000 messages. Now you have to do it with the Suzukis, you have to do it with the Kawasaki. Here we are. With the Kawasaki's, we waited for the 1100 to arrive before doing this because in my opinion, this is a really hot topic and it's something that comes up every time you go to test one of these bikes individually, and inevitably the comparison is made with the other category. In my opinion, these are two different categories, but obviously within a segment, a maxi segment that we could call fluid because they overlap. So for those choosing one or the other for traveling or for doing something a bit more sporty, it's interesting.
But it's one heart, two souls.
By the way, exactly. In this case, now we're going to get into a bit more detail. It's interesting, and on this topic, trust us and keep following us because in September we'll have more to say, much more.
Big major comparisons.
Exactly. In the case of Kawasaki, the comparison is even tighter because with BMW,
1100, 4 cylinders, same 136 horsepower engine.
Exactly.
Perfectly executed, even with the same final gear ratio, because we looked at the technical specs together, but really two totally different ways of interpreting the same performance, if you will.
Exactly. If with BMW there were also two philosophies, so boxer, shaft drive, 4 cylinders with chain, differences in horsepower, differences in torque, here we're starting from the same technical base. So a frame that isn't exactly the same but is shared because the chassis geometry measurements are different. The engine is now the same because let's remember that when these bikes were available in the 1000 version, so with a 1000 cc displacement, Ninja 1000 SX 143 horsepower versus 120 horsepower, Kawasaki decided to use a single powertrain, although I know you don't like it when I call it powertrain, so a single engine, 1100 cc, 136 horsepower. So the Versys gained 16 horsepower while the Ninja 1100 SX lost 9. And there was a lot of discussion.
Let me ask the question again myself. Why, at a time when these sport touring bikes are all about delivering even more performance, would you make a choice that, if you will, is a bit more conservative? Is that correct?
This decision really sparked a lot of debate. That's exactly why we test them, I have to say. I haven't tried the Ninja 1100 SX yet. I have tested the Versys, so let's get to that.
Me neither.
You haven't tried that one either. So it'll be interesting to see if the Ninja really has lost something and the Versys has gained so much, if they've actually gotten closer. We'll have to see. Obviously, Kawasaki has done a certain kind of work. They've filled out the engine's torque curve. Let's remember that on the road, as they always say, it's torque you use, not power. So for me, it'll be interesting to see how both bikes perform. In the meantime, though, it's interesting to see how Kawasaki has positioned the two bikes. Starting with this SE version, which comes with Brembo calipers, adjustable monoshock, and S23 tires. Okay? With the inevitable, unfortunately, 190/50 rear tire, which is typical of the Japanese. It's typical of the Japanese, but I'm still curious to see how the S23 will perform, because with the S22, the 190/50 worked well. Meanwhile, on the Versys, the calipers are still radial, but branded Kawasaki, and it comes with Bridgestone T32 tires, so it's positioned much more as a touring bike. Here we have the Versys with panniers and the Kawasaki Ninja 1100 SX without panniers, so it's a bit sportier. We'll try both, even without the panniers.
Let me ask you another question, which is worth explaining again for those who haven't followed us before. What does the 190/50 mean compared to the 190/55? Right, since it's often used on bikes in this category?
Yes, there are only a few left who still use the 190/50, which was very popular some time ago. The 55 has a taller sidewall and improves the bike's handling a bit, while the 190/50 is a bit flatter. But be careful, because this nominal size, a 190/50, actually has a sidewall range that can even get close to a 55. With the S22, the bike worked well, and now with the new S23s, I'm curious to see how it will go. And as I was saying, this is a slightly more touring-oriented version.
But in my opinion, this setup also makes sense, especially to further differentiate it from the same engine, giving it an even more touring-oriented purpose, maybe with a slightly slower pace and a bit more of a sporty character.
We'll see if that's really the case.
Yeah, all right.
We'll see. Obviously, just by looking at them, you can tell which one is more touring oriented and which one is sportier. But I'm curious to try them out on a nice mixed route to see if these bikes can really connect with each other and if they truly are alternatives to one another or not.
Stefano, I'd stop here. Let's get changed and set off on our ride. We'll make our first stop and do an analysis just after the highway so we can assess protection, vibration, and constant speed, as well as engine RPM. Maybe we'll also do a quick check on fuel consumption on the highway since that's important too. Heat transmission, all the initial parameters that matter to anyone planning to travel and cover a good number of kilometers even just for a long trip. So that'll be the first step, and then we'll continue our story, stopping at various points along the way.
Is it better to go with a sport touring or a crossover? In my opinion, that's a question that will never really have a definitive answer. But in this case, with Kawasaki, we'll at least try to give you an idea of the intended use.
Let's go! Lake Hydro, we've covered the first 200 kilometers. By the way, Stefano, today is a wonderful day. Mild weather after days of scorching heat, a perfectly blue sky, smooth asphalt right from the first kilometers, and above all, our two main stars.
And today, in any case, is the kind of day that makes you want to go out riding. You're not sweating, it's not hot, it's not cold, you just feel great. So we're really enjoying the bikes.
Let's go back to what we mentioned at the beginning in the studio. Sport touring or crossover, a topic that sharing the engine, in this case the 1100 engine from Kawasaki. The first impressions, because we've already covered a few kilometers on the highway, we already have some initial data on fuel consumption. What role does this engine play in this comparison? Maybe it's actually the real cornerstone of the project.
Yes, I would start right there because the Kawasaki 4-cylinder is truly an incredible engine for its smoothness and creaminess. I call it an engine with Nutella-like tuning because it's always right there, always at your fingertips, and you can feel this on both bikes. It was already present in the, let's say, 1-liter displacement. And with the 1100, they further filled out the Torca curve. So in my opinion, the engine is the absolute star of these two bikes. And it's an engine that I've always known. Well, when people go to test it, they write to me, I didn't expect that, because it's an engine that really surprises you. Mainly because, well, there's this idea that an inline-4 is an engine with no low-end torque and only works at high revs, but that's not the case. It depends on how the inline-4 is built. In this case, the focus is on torque. I remind you that maximum power is delivered at 9,000 RPM.
Not extremely high, as you might expect.
To give a reference, the BMW Boxer, which is often used as an example or benchmark, the 1300 Boxer, while here we're talking about an 1100, reaches its maximum power at 7,750 RPM. So that's 1,350 RPM lower than this 4-cylinder. So it's anything but lacking in low-end torque. In other words, it's an engine that delivers a lot at low revs. What Kawasaki has done with the 1100 is give it even more low-end power. So much so that you practically never go above 5,000 RPM even when you're riding fast.
Let me point out to those watching the beauty of the almost off-idle response. At 1500 RPM, the engine...
There's no lack of torque at low revs.
Exactly. There's constant torque even at 1500 RPM, which is almost like the engine is idling, yet it pulls you out smoothly. It's soft, and as you said, not only is it super smooth, but the throttle response is also perfectly in tune with what you need.
One thing I like to highlight, as we were just discussing, is the engineering refinement of these bikes. Everything is smooth. Everything seems to have no friction. The gearbox is precise, the front brake, the free play is almost frictionless, and this lets you feel the brake to the millimeter. You can brake with your pinky finger because you have less, let's say, wasted effort. You only use your strength to actually brake. So everything they manage to do, they do extremely well. So we'll talk about the suspension maybe in the next segment, but here the engine is definitely the star of the show.
Let me make a quick note about fuel consumption. Today, so far, we've covered 200 kilometers, a mix of highway riding to get here and some twisty roads. The Versys definitely consumes more. We're talking about around 16.5 kilometers per liter. On the other hand, with the Ninja, we almost reached 20 kilometers per liter.
There are a few more kilos to carry, but it's not that much more.
Is it maybe the frontal surface area that makes a difference?
The bulk, the frontal surface area. So in the end, it does affect fuel consumption a bit. Honestly, I expected less of a difference because the engines are the same, the gear ratios are the same at 130 km/h, 4,600 RPM. So they're really running
to the turbo diesel average. But quite obviously, the Ninja benefits a bit more.
Because of the aerodynamic profile.
Because of the aerodynamic profile and the lower weight. Kawasaki claims 234 kilon for the Ninja, but on our scale we measured 235 with a full tank. So there's just a 1 kilo difference between the two scales.
We can say that's within the scale's margin of tolerance, so it's acceptable. Let me ask another question since we're on the topic of highways and wind protection, and I'll give you my very personal take on it. Well, it's decent, the Ninja decent, even though it has the more practical system of the two for raising and lowering the windshield. It's good, but I expected a bit more from the Versys, which, however, has a somewhat cumbersome system for adjusting the windshield. You basically have to do it while stopped.
So, yes, I partially agree with you in the sense that the Ninja, for being a sport touring bike, works well. So obviously, if you get off the Versys and get on the Ninja, you realize you're much more exposed, your arms, your legs, but you don't get any turbulence, and your helmet is well protected. I like the Versys. I use the windshield in the lowest position because since I'm not very tall, I find that it vibrates a little less.
Yes, the handlebar vibrates less.
But in terms of aerodynamic protection, your legs are well covered. It's just the forearm that sticks out a bit. Maybe by adding a small extra deflector to the handguard, you could improve it even more. But we're really splitting hairs here. This is a bike you can ride 1,000 kilometers in a day on without any problem.
Applause for the seats. Both are exceptional in my opinion. A clear sign of great attention to touring comfort. Stefano, let's pause here in terms of our story. We'll cover a few more kilometers and then we'll start to go deeper into the chassis, the braking system, the mapping. In short, we still have a lot to talk about.
Once I was a happy kid, smiling all the time. Then love left me high and dry. Nobody knows the reason why. Me, oh my, oh me, underneath the crying tree.
Quick question.
I already know.
How much lean angle did you get?
With the Versys, 46.
And 48. So, see, I'm even more excited. I wanted to make a quick note about the engine. Then we'll talk about the chassis because there's been a lot of discussion about the Ninja. As we know, Kawasaki has standardized the engines. So the Ninja lost some horsepower going from 143 to 136, and there's been a ton of debate. I was expecting 150. I think that if Kawasaki hadn't said anything to anyone and just let people try the bike, no one would have had anything to say. Probably no one would have even noticed. I'd say at the very least it pulls as much as the previous one. In fact, I'll go further. It actually pulls more than the previous one at the revs you use on the road. Today, we practically never went over 6,000 RPM, maybe even 5.
Yeah.
The engine has, let's say, the power delivery has been shifted to where it's needed. So in my opinion, the power you felt, plus the throttle response is super clean. The ride-by-wire is really good. The mappings are really good. Enough about the engine. Let's talk about the chassis because there's a lot to discuss. So obviously you get on the Versys, you use it, super comfortable, and you also find it very fast. It's very quick, helped by a significant lever arm because it has a really wide handlebar.
Yeah, that's true.
And the 180 rear tire helps. So you get on the Ninja and it feels like a scaled down bike, about half a size smaller. So in the end, which one do I choose? I like it. Here we even have the same engines, the same power. It's clear that the rider's physical build also plays a part. Let's say it steers the choice a bit.
Yes, it pushes you in one direction or the other. So personally, beyond the fact that, as you said, with the Versys, you immediately get that instant sensation, great riding feel, and really awesome corner entry speed. At the same time, I really like this front end solidity, and if you will, even this greater slowness, partly due to the 190/50 tire.
No, it's a combination of things. Shorter suspension, stiffer suspension, wider tire.
It all counts, but it creates a different feeling that brings you back to a kind of sportiness. That's really nice, a bit more masculine if you will, right? Where you have to ride it with a bit more body, a bit more character, and you don't lose anything in terms of riding pleasure. They're really just two different styles. By the way, about the suspension discussion.
The Ninja has 141 at the front, 141 at the rear. So this one too, we're at 150, 152, so it's higher. Is the wheelbase shorter? Much shorter, 1440, 1520. By the way, there's also a 22 kilo difference between the two, without the bags, of course, because we weighed the Versys without the bags.
227, 249.
With our 5 liters of fuel, just so you know. The tanks are a bit different, 19 and 21. So I posted some stories and after asking for questions, I actually received some interesting ones. I asked which one you prefer over the other, and one of the guys commented, yes, it depends if you're traveling as a couple or alone. So the topic of traveling isn't up for debate. You can travel with both. If you're traveling as a couple with your girlfriend along, carrying a lot of luggage, and you want a really comfortable seat, the Versys is obviously always gigantic, yes. Last year, I went to Corsica with my son, with luggage, with the bags. That's how I traveled. But of course, it does require a bit more sacrifice.
Of course, of course. It's also worth pointing out, Stefano, that despite the slightly more forward-leaning position and the riding comfort, it's not at all a drawback.
No. Last year, I covered a lot of miles, even carrying a passenger. And I also had my other son with the 125, so we were going slowly too. I never found the riding position to be forward-leaning or tiring. It's a fantastic position for a sport tourer. In my opinion, right now, the 1100, while we wait for the R1300 RS, is the best representative of this classic sport touring segment because the engine has improved and the ride has always been great. On top of that, there's a lot of quality in the suspension, the brakes, and so on.
Let me ask you a question, since we're talking about suspensions, about the perception of smoothness and the behavior of the fork and monoshock on the Ninja, and the semi-active ones, in this case on the Versys, which respond well to commands and requests. Give me some of your feedback, which would be helpful to understand.
So, I'll start with the Versys. I'll start with the Versys because I've always liked the Showa era, and they once again proved to be excellent suspensions. We kind of tricked it a bit, or rather we adjusted it to follow the load since we added the side cases by adding 4 more clicks of preload, and the Versys improved in terms of handling. The suspension and the fork respond immediately, offering great control. When you switch it to sport mode, it becomes really precise. Of course, when you really start pushing hard, you do feel those extra 22 kilos.
The bike floats a bit more, it moves around a bit more.
But in my opinion, by changing the tires, and I said this during the presentation too, especially the front one, which doesn't grip the asphalt that much. The Versys is a bit light at the front, but that's really just because of the weight distribution, right?
Yes, when we removed, let's take away the chart, but anyway, it's 49% at the front, 51% at the rear, so actually the opposite. The opposite of the Ninja.
It's a bit light, and on top of that, the front end isn't exactly, when you're leaned over, it doesn't push that much. So, plus weighing 22 kilo more, if you put it all together, as long as you're riding at a medium-high, even high pace, it's fine. But when you push harder, that's when it shows. Personally, I absolutely love the precision. By the way, I have to say the S23 performed really well in this case. Compared to the S22s, which were indeed fast, but when you release the brake, I didn't like the front end of the S22s. It always tended to drop a bit, partly because with the S23, there's much more presence at the front, and moreover, these tires, which I've always said have a very stiff carcass, and I can confirm they are stiff. With a bike that weighs this much, they work well.
Because they're under stress, so that's fine.
It makes them work. And I like the precision. So this sportiness you mentioned, I don't want to call it suspension stiffness because it's not true that it's stiff. The suspension responds immediately and absorbs well. Obviously, everything is tighter and the bike is much more precise. Of course, it requires you to use your body a bit more.
But it's rewarding, can I say that? Yes, yes. The fast corners we took, even when you feel the bike entering the turn and it just stays there beautifully, you look and with the direction you've set, the bike follows you.
And it's not just that, it really makes you feel sporty. In fact, today while we were riding around the lakes, we saw quite a few of them, even some Germans with the Ninja 1000 SX or the 1100, all dressed in leather, while those riding the Versys were dressed for touring. This already puts it in the position of 2 different bikes. Here there's the central fairing, here there isn't. That distinction makes sense.
So one last detail, then we'll get going again. Stefano, do you agree? We talked about it at lunch. You mentioned the Ninja's slightly forward foot pegs.
It's so much fun to ride that when you start to push it, I'd actually like the foot pegs to be set just a bit further back, and I'll add something else that I'll show you. When I get on and start riding on my toes a bit, my big size 44 foot hits the pin. The pin, and here you can tell it's the smallest bike. Basically, the bike is more compact, so in the end, well, anyway, it makes sense. The nice thing is that when you get off the Versys and get on this one, it basically feels like a bike with a smaller engine.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, now let's throw the keys on the table. Which one do you choose to ride the last stretch? Good question. Both. It depends on the road. It depends on how much you've ridden. It depends on how many of you are riding. All right, we'll see you in a bit for the conclusions and our journey continues. Stefano, this is the perfect way to end the day riding a sport tourer or a crossover. This setting, no matter where you are, ideally I'd say in Italy, but really anywhere in the world, is the perfect place to experience life in the saddle. I'd say it's time to wrap things up. Let's do a quick analysis going bike by bike, pluses, minuses, what we liked, what could be improved, and then as usual, we'll finish with the prices.
All right, let's start with the Versys.
It's gained some power, right?
Yes, I really liked it. The power delivery, I already mentioned it during the presentation and I'll confirm it here, was absolutely spot on. It's a very well-balanced, very stable bike with electronic suspension that works really well and a great engine. I'm not crazy about the gearbox, which feels a bit rubbery in its response and sometimes misses downshifts. However, the quick shifter works very well and the riding modes are really well tuned for traveling. Absolutely the queen of highway journeys. I mean, it's comfortable for two with good wind protection.
It's big with plenty of space on the seat.
For the windscreen, I prefer an adjustment that's a bit less complicated.
Yes, because you're forced to stop. Since it has two knobs, you have to stop, tighten them, and then set off again.
And then they say, yes, it's true that once you adjust it for your height, because for example, when we're in places like this where I enjoy riding, I like to lower it, and instead, when you're on the highway, maybe you raise it. It doesn't create turbulence, but it does have a slight optical distortion. Let me ask you a question instead. Analog, digital, or a mix of both?
Good topic. So, in my opinion, the Versys' instrumentation is now a bit outdated. Even though I'm attached to the idea of analog and I like seeing the needle go up here, it feels like there's a real lack of an aesthetically more satisfying evolutionary step. Because on the other hand, if I think about a fully digital one, I don't like that either. The numbers are too small. Maybe we're in a situation where, in my opinion, this part could be improved. Also because, let me remind you, the average user who's likely to approach this bike is someone of a certain age, not exactly young.
Make the numbers big.
Big numbers for people with presbyopia like me.
Exactly. And another thing to improve, the USB port. Now this, in my opinion, and in the opinion of pretty much everyone, is not up to the quality of the Kawasaki project, which otherwise is very high quality.
It should be integrated.
Yes, there's a power outlet here, let's say the old-fashioned kind, 12 volts. Maybe they could have turned this into a USB port. I don't want to offer solutions because it's always easy to talk after the fact. But these are just two small things. On the other hand, very, very good. The padding of the seat, both for the rider and the passenger.
So we did a segment with you as the passenger and the feeling was good even in terms of handling the grab handles and foot pegs.
The Versys wins, obviously, if you have to travel long distances, if you have to cover a lot of kilometers with a passenger, and maybe here you can even add a top case, which actually looks good aesthetically.
So it's integrated.
The Ninja with a top case, well, not really. It's not that you can't do it, you can because people do. But here, it's clear that if your life on the bike is mostly as a couple, then the Versys is definitely the bike to prefer.
Can I make a comment instead? The rear brake didn't fully convince me. Its response isn't quite adequate for the weight and also when you need some support while cornering.
I agree with you. It's a rear brake that you'd expect to have a bit more bite, especially when you're riding two up downhill on roads like these. In my opinion, it needs just a little more there, whereas the rear brake on the Ninja is absolutely top-notch. Just like the front brakes, which with the Brembo caliper have a good bite, not excessive, but right where you want it.
So let's move away from the Ninja. We went from the Versys, the queen of cross tourers, to the Ninja, and in my opinion, when you get off that one and hop on this, it feels like such a tiny bike. You said it earlier too, even on the last stretch riding up here, at a certain point you think, wow though. But all it takes is one corner in between and it's immediately smooth.
It's beautiful. I really like how precise it is, and even on tight roads. Here we're on a pretty twisty, narrow route. I expected it to struggle more, but actually no, it's very well balanced. The suspension is mechanical. There were people here saying that maybe they expected the 2025 Ninja to come with semi-active suspension. In my opinion, that's not in the spirit of the bike, and it's not even necessary, because with the knob you can preload the shock when riding two up. There it is. There was also the version, let's say the non-SE, and the suspension is really, really well made. I mean, they work. Showa, in this case, does a good job. They respond immediately. They're very consistent in how they perform. The Versys ones are good too, but here, since they're mechanical, you feel it more, and I actually prefer that. Also here, something that definitely needs improvement, the USB port is barely integrated.
Yes, absolutely.
Maybe the windscreen could use a bit more attention, not just in terms of adjustment like this, but also a little more vertical movement.
Can I point out that in my opinion, the mirrors here are just a bit too low, and positioned like this, they're less effective than those on the Versys, especially when you're moving through traffic. Let me take this opportunity to ask you a question, also to help us less experienced folks understand. Why do you choose, well, in this case, Brembo calipers because that's a step up, but why pair a Nissin Master cylinder with Brembo calipers and yet it works well? Isn't that a bit strange?
No, it's not strange. I mean, it's not strange because in the end, the suppliers follow the manufacturer's instructions.
choices, we'd have to ask Kawasaki for sure. In this case, the SE is positioned as a truly premium model and features Brembo calipers, which, for everyone, including the Japanese, are definitely a product that they're the M432s, not the M50 or the Stilema calipers, but they work well. They have that slightly aggressive bite that I notice on all the bikes that use them. Here, they've managed to tone it down quite well. The rear brake, as I said, is very good. In my opinion, the ergonomic triangle is very well balanced for this type of bike. And I want to go back to explaining a bit when people ask me, is this one better or that one? First of all, I think your height.
Sit on it.
Well, your height is what kind of guides your choice. I know I'm repeating myself compared to what I said in the other segment, but if you're a bit shorter, here you have 20 kilo less to handle, a seat that's 5 millimeter lower, and the bike is narrower at the point where you put your legs down so you can reach the ground a bit better. But if you put it all together, if you're a bit taller,
The center of gravity is a bit higher.
if you're really tall, here you might end up feeling a bit cramped. If you're not that tall, you'll fit perfectly here. If you're really tall, you'll be perfectly comfortable on the Versys.
Stefano, I think there's still one last topic to wrap up nicely, just like today's tire profile. How did the 190/50 perform?
Well, kudos to Bridgestone, because with the S23, they managed to make a 190/50 that works like a 55, so that's good. If you look at the profile, it's very round, the tire isn't flat, so it remains easy to handle. So if you ask me how much it loses compared to the 55, I'd say, in this case, very little. So it's not just the size, but also the type of tire we choose to mount. They're a bit sensitive to longitudinal seams, so...
It's the stiffness of the carcass, in your opinion, that has some effect, okay?
But the 190/50 in this case, especially on the Ninja, I have to say, has always worked very well.
Stefano, so now let's get to the prices and therefore to the conclusion of our test. 16,940 for the Ninja 1100 SX SE version. And for the Versys,
17,490 euros with the side cases, and this is the SE Tourer version with the cases installed. The cases on this bike are convenient also because they have an inner bag. I used them last year. They're not very big cases, but they work well.
so the question was, sport touring or crossover?
We haven't solved it.
We don't have the answers also because I got distracted.
No, that's not true. In part, we do have it because we're starting to define some points. Your height, your physical build, whether you want to travel more or less, if you feel more sporty, if you want to wear full leathers or full touring gear, these things already steer your choice one way or the other.
But the truth is, now I put the two identical keys there, you pick one, you pick the other, and you're happy. Exactly. So this is where our family comparison ends, we can call it that.
Fratricidal struggle.
Fratricidal struggle, exactly. Thanks to Stefano Cordara, our director at Red, mechanical engineer who always gives you and gives us all the answers we want to know and sometimes don't dare to ask. Right below for Stefano.
We'll definitely see you in the next video, but I already know we'll see each other down here with 1,000 questions and 1,000 answers from us. And anyway, as we've told you, the topic of crossovers and sport touring is absolutely not over. We have something pretty important in the works, but we'll talk about it after the holidays. See you next time.